Robert Winters had lived in the quiet suburb of Pine Creek Estates for over 15 years. As a civil engineer who traveled frequently for work, he owned two adjacent properties in the neighborhood, one where he lived and another undeveloped lot he purchased as an investment for his retirement. He had always paid his dues for both properties and maintained cordial, if distant, relationships with the members of the Homeowners Association. The undeveloped lot held special significance for Robert. It was just over an acre of gently sloping land with four majestic oak trees that had to be at least a century old. He had purchased it 7 years ago when old Mr. Harrington, his neighbor and friend, had needed to sell quickly for medical expenses. They'd shaken hands over a fair price, and Robert had promised to preserve the old oaks that Mr. Harrington's grandfather had planted. Robert had plans to build a small cottage there eventually, a place where he could pursue his woodworking hobby in peace while still being close to his main residence. The 3-month assignment in Singapore had been grueling but lucrative. Robert had been tasked with overseeing structural integrity assessments on a series of aging high-rises, working 60-hour weeks in sweltering humidity. Each night, he'd fall into bed in his sterile corporate apartment, dreaming of returning to the peaceful quiet of Pine Creek Estates. During the rare video calls home, his house sitter Jenny had mentioned some increased activity in the neighborhood, but nothing that had raised any alarms. It was a perfect spring morning when Robert's flight finally landed. The cherry blossoms were in full bloom, and despite his jet lag, he felt a surge of energy as he drove through the familiar neighborhood streets. He rolled down his windows to breathe in the sweet air, mentally planning to spend the afternoon checking on his properties and perhaps having a welcome home beer on his back deck. Robert's contentment evaporated instantly as he approached the turn where his vacant lot came into view. He blinked hard, certain that exhaustion was causing him to hallucinate. Where there had once been a grassy field with his cherished oak trees, there now stood a gleaming community pool complex, complete with a cabana, deck chairs, and a small playground. 3 of the 4 oak trees were completely gone, with only one remaining at the far corner of the property, now surrounded by concrete. He slammed on his brakes, causing the car behind him to honk angrily as it swerved around him. Robert barely noticed. His hands trembled as he pulled to the curb and stared in disbelief. A large, professionally printed banner hung across the front entrance: Pine Creek Estates Community Pool, grand opening next weekend. Several people in the pool area turned to look at him, including a woman he recognized as Diane Wilcox, the HOA's secretary, who was directing workers setting up patio furniture. She waved cheerfully, apparently not registering his shocked expression through the car window. Robert felt sick to his stomach. The land had been cleared, excavated, and completely transformed. This wasn't some temporary structure or misunderstanding. This was a major construction project that would have taken months to complete. The pool itself was kidney-shaped and substantial, surrounded by an expansive concrete deck. A small building that presumably contained changing rooms and equipment stood where his favorite oak tree had once spread its branches. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands and began taking pictures, documenting everything from the signage to the structures. A cold fury was building inside him, but beneath it lay a deeper sense of violation that made his chest tight. This wasn't just about property rights, though those had clearly been trampled. This was about coming home to find that something precious had been stolen while he was away, something he could never get back. Fuming, Robert immediately drove to the home of Gerald Thompson, the HOA president. The Thompson residence was a 2-story colonial at the best address in the neighborhood, immaculately maintained with professional landscaping and a luxury SUV in the circular driveway. Robert had never particularly liked Gerald, a retired corporate lawyer who had moved to Pine Creek Estates 5 years ago and quickly maneuvered his way into the HOA presidency. Gerald ran the association like a small kingdom, notorious for his rigid enforcement of even the most trivial HOA regulations. Robert rang the doorbell repeatedly until the chimes were interrupted by the door swinging open. Gerald stood there in golf attire, clearly annoyed at the interruption. "Robert, you're back from your trip," Gerald said, recognition dawning. His surprise seemed genuine, but it quickly morphed into visible discomfort when Robert demanded an explanation about the pool. "Why don't you come in? No need to discuss this on my doorstep." Robert followed Gerald into an ornate living room, refusing the offered seat and remaining standing, arms crossed. "I want to know how the hell you justify building a community pool on my private property, and I want to know now." Gerald poured himself a drink without offering one to Robert. "There must be some misunderstanding," he said, his tone patronizing. "The pool has been built on community-designated land according to our records. The board identified that parcel as the perfect location last fall, and we've been through all the proper channels." Robert pulled out his phone and brought up digital copies of his property deed and tax statements, thrusting the screen toward Gerald. "This is my land. I've owned it for 7 years. I've paid taxes on it and HOA fees for it every year." Gerald barely glanced at the screen. "Those must be outdated records. Our documentation shows that particular parcel was designated for community use in the original neighborhood plans. He sipped his drink. Besides, the board thoroughly researched the title before proceeding. We're not amateurs, Robert. I was never notified about any of this, Robert said, his voice rising. You can't just take someone's land and build on it without their consent. Gerald walked to his home office and returned with a folder, extracting several documents. Actually, you were notified. Multiple times. He laid out a series of letters and emails. We sent 3 notices to all homeowners about the special assessment and proposed location. The board voted unanimously to build the pool funded by that assessment. You were given ample opportunity to object. Robert examined the notices. They had indeed been sent to an email address he had abandoned years ago after a hacking incident and to his home address, but without his lot number included in the documentation. Technically sent, but clearly designed to slip past his attention. This is deliberate obfuscation, Robert said. You knew I was overseas. You have my current contact information on file for association matters. Gerald shrugged. It's not our responsibility to chase down homeowners who don't keep their contact information updated. Your lack of response was taken as approval, as clearly stated in the notices. Everything was done properly and by the book. His tone grew increasingly dismissive. The project has been in progress for months, Robert. Where have you been? Working in Singapore, as recorded in my homeowner profile that you have on file, Robert replied through gritted teeth. Gerald waved his hand as if swatting away an annoying insect. Well, what's done is done. The grand opening is next weekend and the community is thrilled. Robert felt his blood pressure rising. Those were 100-year-old oak trees you cut down. That was my retirement investment you paved over. You should be thanking us, Gerald said coolly, straightening his golf shirt. Your remaining property value just increased significantly with this new amenity. The pool adds value to every home in Pine Creek Estates. He checked his watch pointedly. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a tea time to make. Determined to get to the bottom of the situation, Robert spent the next morning making calls. By noon, he had secured appointments with Monica Chen, a highly recommended property surveyor, and James Okafor, a real estate attorney specializing in homeowner association disputes. While waiting for these professionals, Robert drove to the county records office. The clerk, a sympathetic older woman named Doris, helped him pull every document related to his property. Together, they confirmed what he already knew. His ownership was ironclad, with no easements or community designations on the undeveloped lot. Honey, they had no right, Doris said, shaking her head as she made copies of everything for him. No right at all. 2 days later, Monica completed her survey, setting up her equipment at the edges of the pool complex while curious residents watched. The HOA facilities manager approached several times asking increasingly pointed questions, but Monica simply smiled and continued her work. It's not even close, she told Robert that evening, spreading the survey map across his dining room table. The pool encroaches on your property by 100%. Not a single corner of that complex is on HOA land. She pointed to the borders, property stakes, and GPS coordinates. I documented everything according to legal standards. This will stand up in court if needed. Meanwhile, James had been conducting his own investigation. He arrived at Robert's house looking grim but with a glint of righteous anger in his eyes. You were right to be suspicious, James said, opening his laptop. The HOA filed paperwork claiming abandonment of the property after you had failed to respond to their notices and neglected the land for an extended period. That's absurd, Robert exclaimed. I maintained that lot regularly, paid every tax bill, every HOA fee. I know, James replied. Their claim wouldn't have stood up to any serious scrutiny, but they never intended it to face scrutiny. They filed the minimum required notices in the least visible way possible. Small print legal notices in the classified section of the county newspaper, sent certified mail to your old address that was returned undelivered, and emails to an account they knew was outdated. Robert felt sick. How do you know they knew it was outdated? James turned his laptop around. Because I filed a records request for all HOA documentation related to your properties. Look at this email from 3 months ago. Robert read the screen, his hands clenching into fists. It was an email from Susan Baker, the HOA treasurer, to Gerald. Gerald, I've updated all homeowner contact information as requested, including Robert Winter's new email and phone number from his last dues payment. Should I use these to send the pool assessment notices? Gerald's reply was damning. No, use what we have on file from last year. He's overseas anyway, and that lot is perfect for the pool project. The fewer obstacles, the better. There's more, James said, scrolling down to show a series of exchanges between board members. They specifically discussed your absence as an opportunity. Here's one from Gerald to the entire board. With Winters out of the country until spring, we have a window to move forward. The location is ideal, and by the time he returns, it will be a fait accompli. Far easier to ask forgiveness than permission, especially when property values increase for everyone. Further investigation revealed that Gerald's brother-in-law owned the construction company that had received the no-bid contract for the pool project, at a price 30% above market rate. The board had also authorized a substantial project management fee that had been paid directly to Gerald for his oversight of the construction. They knew exactly what they were doing, James told Robert, closing his laptop with a decisive click. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a calculated land grab with elements of fraud, misappropriation of HOA funds, and clear conflicts of interest. They never expected you to fight back with professional help. Robert stared at the survey maps and legal documents spread across his table. So what do we do now? James smiled grimly. Now we prepare to give them a nasty surprise of their own. Rather than immediately confronting the HOA with what he had discovered, Robert followed James' advice to gather more evidence and develop a strategic response. If we show our hand too early, they'll start covering their tracks, James warned. Let's build an airtight case while they're still confident they've gotten away with it. For the next 2 weeks, Robert worked methodically. He documented everything related to the property, photographing the pool complex from every angle, collecting historical pictures of the land before construction, and gathering 15 years' worth of tax receipts and HOA payments for both properties. He even found photos of the century-old oak trees from a neighborhood picnic 5 years earlier, with a plaque visible that noted their historical significance. Those trees were part of the original homestead from 1912, Robert told James, his voice tight with controlled anger. That's why Mr. Harrington made me promise to preserve them when I bought the land. James arranged for a certified real estate appraiser to determine the current market value of the property. The appraiser's report was comprehensive. Given the location, zoning, and comparable sales in the area, Robert's undeveloped acre was worth substantially more than he paid for it 7 years ago. If we include the mature trees as part of the valuation, which we absolutely should, the property value increases by another 15%, the appraiser explained. Heritage trees like those have significant value in high-end developments. Meanwhile, Robert quietly approached several other homeowners he trusted. Without revealing his legal strategy, he asked general questions about the pool project and recorded their responses with their permission. The pattern was consistent. Most homeowners had received minimal information about the property's ownership, being told only that the association had secured an ideal location for the community amenity. Sandra Kozlowski, who lived across from Robert's main residence, was particularly helpful. As a retired paralegal, she had questioned the special assessment and requested documentation. They stonewalled me, she confided over coffee on Robert's porch. When I pressed for property records, Gerald told me everything was proprietary board information during the negotiation phase. I knew something was fishy, but I couldn't prove it. She paused, looking troubled. They cut down those beautiful old oaks in a single day. I cried when I saw the stumps. Robert also discovered that the HOA had taken out a substantial loan to cover part of the pool construction, using future HOA dues as collateral, a move that required a 2/3 homeowner vote that had never actually occurred. Throughout this information-gathering phase, Robert maintained a perfectly normal demeanor in public. He waved to board members at the grocery store, stopped to chat with neighbors about his trip to Singapore, and even complimented Diane Wilcox on the flower beds she planted near the pool entrance. Meanwhile, the HOA proceeded with their grand opening plans. Glossy invitations arrived at every home in Pine Creek Estates, including Robert's. The card featured photos of the pool complex and announced a Saturday afternoon celebration with catered food, music, and a ribbon-cutting ceremony. 3 days before the grand opening, Robert attended a town hall meeting announced on the invitation. The community center was packed with homeowners eager to hear about the new amenity. Gerald stood at the podium, radiating confidence and pride. This project represents the culmination of careful planning and stewardship of our community resources, Gerald proclaimed, advancing through a slick PowerPoint presentation showing the construction progress. The Pine Creek Estates community pool will enhance our property values and provide recreation for generations to come. Robert sat silently in the back row, recording the entire presentation on his phone. He noted how Gerald carefully avoided mentioning the property's previous ownership, referring only to securing the ideal location and completing necessary site preparation. When a newer resident asked about the location selection process, Gerald smoothly explained that they had found unused land that had been designated for community use in the original neighborhood plan. Robert's jaw tightened at the blatant lie, but he maintained his composure, exchanging a knowing glance with Sandra across the room. As Robert left the meeting, Gerald caught up with him in the parking lot. "Robert, I'm glad to see you're taking this well after our discussion. Will you be joining us for the grand opening Saturday? It would mean a lot to have all homeowners there." Robert smiled politely. I wouldn't miss it for the world. The day before the grand opening, Robert met with James and his team of legal assistants for a final review of their strategy. They had assembled an imposing array of legal documents, evidence binders, and formal complaints ready to be filed with various authorities. Everything is in order, James confirmed, checking items off his list. The process server is brief and ready. We have appointments scheduled with the district attorney's office on Monday and the state real estate commission on Tuesday. He looked up at Robert. Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed this way? There's still time to approach them privately first. Robert shook his head firmly. They didn't give me the courtesy of a private conversation before they stole my land and cut down 100-year-old trees. Why should I extend what they denied me? He picked up a framed photo of himself with Mr. Harrington standing beside one of the magnificent oaks. Besides, this was never just about the land. This was about abuse of power. Others need to see the consequences. At precisely 5:00 p.m., time to catch the board members as they arrived home from work, but before they could leave for dinner engagements, 6 process servers fanned out across Pine Creek Estates. Each carried a leather portfolio containing identical sets of documents, a cease and desist order, evidence of the board's deliberate deception, and a demand for immediate compensation at triple the market value of the land plus damages for the unauthorized construction. The documents also included notice that Robert had filed complaints with the State Real Estate Commission and the District Attorney's Office for fraud, misappropriation of HOA funds, and violation of fiduciary duty. As a backup plan that James called the nuclear option, Robert had prepared a lawsuit that would force the HOA to remove the pool and restore his land to its original condition, at their expense, which would bankrupt the association. Robert deliberately chose not to be present for the serving of papers. Instead, he sat on his back deck with a glass of whiskey, watching the sunset and waiting for the inevitable fallout. It didn't take long. His phone began buzzing with text messages from neighbors who had witnessed process servers approaching board members' homes. By 6:30 p.m., social media neighborhood groups were ablaze with speculation. At 7:12 p.m., Robert's doorbell rang. He opened it to find Gerald standing there, his face flushed with a combination of rage and panic, clutching the legal documents. "What the hell is this?" Gerald demanded, waving the papers. "You're suing us personally? For millions? Are you insane?" Robert leaned against the doorframe, his posture relaxed but his eyes hard. "No, Gerald, I'm deadly serious. Everything in those documents is factual and supported by evidence." He nodded toward the papers. "I particularly recommend pages 12 through 17, where your emails discussing the deliberate deception are reproduced in full. The district attorney found those quite interesting when my attorney spoke with him this morning." Gerald's face paled. "This will destroy the HOA. You'll hurt every homeowner in Pine Creek Estates." "No, Gerald, your actions have put the HOA at risk. The difference is significant." Robert straightened up. "But unlike you, I actually care about this community. That's why I've included reasonable settlement terms on the final page. You have until 9 a.m. tomorrow, 1 hour before your grand opening celebration, to accept them." Gerald's phone began ringing. He glanced at it, the HOA treasurer calling. "This isn't over," he muttered. "You're right about that," Robert agreed. "An emergency HOA meeting has been called for 8 p.m. at the community center. I'm sure you'll want to be there to explain to everyone why their HOA dues might triple next year to pay for your legal defense." He started to close the door, then paused. "I made my position clear. The ball is in your court now." As Gerald stalked back to his car, Robert noticed several neighbors watching from their driveways, some with phone cameras discreetly recording the confrontation. By morning, everyone in Pine Creek Estates would know what their HOA board had done, and the grand opening celebration would become something very different indeed. The emergency HOA meeting that evening was standing room only. Robert watched the live stream from home as Gerald attempted to downplay the situation, but the other board members, clearly shaken by the legal documents, began distancing themselves from his decisions. The HOA's attorney, hastily called in, could be seen frantically whispering to board members as homeowners demanded answers. By midnight, Robert received a call from James. "They're panicking," he reported. "The treasurer has already turned over financial records showing Gerald's brother-in-law kicked back part of the construction contract to Gerald's consulting company. The district attorney's office is interested in pursuing charges." Dawn brought the first concrete response, a formal email from the HOA's attorney requesting an immediate meeting. By 8:30 a.m., Robert and James sat across from the entire board and their legal counsel in the community center. Gerald was notably silent, his earlier bluster replaced by grim resignation. "My clients recognize the irregularities in this situation," the HOA attorney began cautiously. "You mean the theft of my client's land, destruction of heritage trees, and misappropriation of HOA funds?" James countered, laying out in large photos of the property before and after construction. Facing potential criminal charges and personal liability, the HOA board crumbled. Gerald resigned as president on the spot, walking out without a word. The grand opening was immediately canceled via mass text to all residents. By noon, the board's lawyer had contacted James with a settlement offer that included purchasing the land at double its appraised value, covering all of Robert's legal fees and issuing a public apology to the community. "It's a solid offer," James acknowledged when they reviewed it privately. "You could walk away with over $500,000 and let this be their problem now." Robert considered this, staring out the window at children playing in the distance. "I want to add conditions," he said finally. "This isn't just about me." The next day, Robert presented his counteroffer. He accepted the financial terms but added his own conditions. The entire board would need to resign within 30 days. The HOA bylaws would be amended to require transparent communication for all major decisions, and a new oversight committee of elected residents would review all contracts over $10,000. And one more thing, Robert added. "I want my name added to the pool's official designation, Winters Community Pool, not out of ego, but as a permanent reminder of what happened here." To everyone's surprise, Robert announced he would use most of the settlement money to establish a neighborhood improvement fund, with the first project being the planting of new oak saplings, descendants of the original trees, which a university arboretum had fortunately preserved through acorns collected years earlier. "The trees were never just mine," he explained to Sandra, who had agreed to chair the new oversight committee. "They belong to the community's history. This way, they still will." 6 months later, a very different ceremony took place at the pool complex. Under clear blue skies, Robert stood beside Elizabeth Chen, the newly elected HOA president, a retired judge who had campaigned on transparency and accountability. Together, they cut a ribbon, officially opening the Winters Community Pool. "Today marks not just the opening of a community amenity," Elizabeth announced to the gathered residents, "but a recommitment to the values that make a neighborhood truly special: honesty, respect for each other's rights, and proper stewardship of our shared resources." She turned to Robert. "We thank Mr. Winters not only for his generosity in allowing the community to keep this wonderful facility, but for reminding us that justice matters even in the smallest of communities." As children splashed in the pool that summer, 4 young oak saplings took root in special planters at each corner of the co.